Hello, my name is Dr. Jackalyn, and I'm with DTP-Leadership Group. And this is Hot Topic Bold Talk. This is podcast 57. And the title of it is Do You Know How Racism is Fed so it continues in our country? Now, I'm going to give you some answers. My simplest answer is white privilege feeds racism. Now, in podcast 56, I firmly stated that racism is it is a systemic process that oppresses persons of color to provide advantages to Caucasians. It's embedded in every aspect of our society. It feeds the other isms that are just as detrimental to our country as racism. I also said that as a white person, we cannot deny what happened from the inception of the formation of the United States. I feel thankful that I was a social studies teacher for many years, and I searched out information that I thought was distorted in the way the history books were written. I taught in Del Rio, Texas. Hispanics are a much larger community than Caucasians, and I wanted them to know about their culture. And the few African Americans and Asians that I met that were in school, students, I wanted them to know about their culture. Many times I had to search it out because it wasn't in the history books. And some of the actions being taken today will prevent other stories being in the history books. I read many articles about the formation of the Electoral College from a diverse group of writers and came to understand how it disempowered African American voters even today. I feel disturbed at the number of Caucasians I talk with that have no idea about the Electoral College and how it was formed and the purpose of it. And that many of the founders of our Constitution who helped form the Electoral College were slave owners. The Electoral College helped to maintain slavery, and many outstanding legal minds have said it gave states the autonomy to introduce discriminatory voting laws, despite the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that was built to prevent it. We see that continually with the gerrymandering that's going on in some of the Republican states. As Caucasian people, we have used denial to prevent people in our country from seeing the value of African Americans and the other persons of color to our society. We've allowed people to structure our history books so they overemphasize the accomplishments of Caucasians and portray African Americans as inferior, ignorant, and needing to be controlled for their own good. There are many pictures out there that are really demeaning. This picture of African Americans is reinforced continually in movies and pictures. We as Caucasians have allowed these lies about African Americans to exist and continue throughout generations. African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans have brought many talents and skills to our country. Yet many of these stories are not included in the history books that are a part of our public education. It is getting worse due to the Republicans' insistence of changing history books, banning books, and restricting what is taught in school. In my view, we have brainwashed ourselves to believe what we have read and seen in movies or pictures about the people of color. And particularly those individuals that are demanding these changes and distortion of history are living with the pictures they saw in movies and pictures that show persons of color as inferior to whites. So we sit and wonder about the reasons that African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, and Caucasians are banding together, because many of us as Caucasians are joining them, marching and speaking out. In the impassionate eulogy, the civil rights activist Reverend Al Sharpton said, visiting where Floyd died made him realize that what happened there is a metaphor for the African American experience. He said, when I stood at that spot, the reason it got to me is that George Floyd's story has been the story of Black folks. Sharpton said, because ever since 402 or 3 now years ago, the reason we could never be who we wanted and dreamed of being is you keep your knee on our neck. And he continued, what happened to Floyd happens every day in this country. It happens in education, in health services, and every area of American life. It is time to stand up in George's name and say, get your knee off our necks. Now, let me begin to tell you how I began to face the reality of white privilege. In 1988, I was getting ready for a diversity and social justice workshop. And a friend of mine were talking, and she said, we need to look at what Peggy McIntosh has written, since I know she has an article out, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. We decided then that McIntosh's paper would be included in that workshop, and I've included it yearly in my social justice programs. McIntosh tells her own story of discovering her own white privilege. She details the destruction that white privilege does. I read her articles, and I knew that my view of the world would never be the same. Having spent years providing diversity and social justice programs, I know that white privilege must be addressed for us to be able to rid ourselves of racism in our country. I've talked with a number of Caucasians since the death of George Floyd and the many other races that are experiencing hate crimes. The whites I've talked to have many different positions. Some want to know what they can do to contribute to a change in America. Others feel confused about the anger and violence in marches and feel uncomfortable and are concerned about their own safety. Other Caucasians want to deny the difference in white people's lives and the lives of Black people or other races in the U.S. As I talk with them, I indicate that I'm going to share what white privilege is in this podcast, and I want them to listen to what I have to say. After getting clear about my white privilege, I realized I had been immune to white privilege and therefore did not take responsibility for how racism permeated and still permeates the United States. If I will not address white privilege, then I will never understand the statement from Sharpton, get your knee off my neck. Peggy McIntosh's article is now considered a classic by anti-racist educators. I think it's outstanding. It certainly revealed many things to me. Black people have described for years how whites benefit from unearned privilege. McIntosh's article was the first article written by a white person about this subject. Here are some of the things I learned from reading McIntosh's article. Even though I grew up in a household with a mother that was noticeably clear that racism was not acceptable, it took me reading this article years later to realize that I had been taught about the disadvantages of racism to African Americans. However, I had not been taught about white privilege puts me at an advantage. As I began to consider some of McIntosh's list of privileges that I have, I could easily see the disadvantages of white privilege since I was ignorant of what other races experienced. I also had to go beyond understanding and needed to have emotional connection to the fact that I had privileges as a white person that I had not earned. With this statement, McIntosh helped me to know at an emotional level what the invisible knapsack was about. I've come to see white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets which I can count on cashing each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious to. Now, this will be one of several podcasts on white privilege, and I will talk about the current day concept of white immunity rather than white privilege in another podcast. It takes more discussion to fully grasp the importance of knowing, experiencing, and understanding white privilege. I will provide one example in this podcast and many more in the next podcast. As you listen about these advantages, notice how much you want to rationalize, justify, and give excuses for the items on the list if you are white. As whites, we have learned to put aside white privilege so we do not have to face it. So here's one of many examples that Peggy McIntosh gives. This is one of the items. If I should need to move, and be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and in which I would want to live. Now here's my comment about that. We've had fair housing laws in the U.S. for years, yet these laws are undermined by actions of white people to prevent persons of color moving into certain areas of the city or town. And our current social justice network that we use for our week-long program, we have detailed the persons of color will have a harder time in living in specific areas of our city. I've talked to real estate brokers and agents, and they know exactly what is happening and how the fair housing laws are being broken. So thank you for listening. I hope you've heard some things that give you enough evidence that white privilege exists and it's something we need to address so that we can make changes about racism in America.